So welcome to this evening event. We have quite an unusual event, I think, for the Society. This is partly an event that is specifically for an audience that's not present. We are recording this, and what we want is to push it out onto our social media platforms and hopefully have an intimate but engaging conversation about some of the issues that have been coming up within the conference. So the schedule is that we have around 35, 40 minutes of conversation around a number of issues. And then subsequently we will break and wander back into the foyer to actually watch a documentary that's about the second part of this evening, which is the transmission performance, the film of which we will see, which will be seen for the first time tonight. So we'll go out there and watch it and come back in here afterwards. So thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Andy Meir, and I'm taking up a chair here at Salford University in October in Science Communication and Digital Media. And I'm joined by, a remarkable panel, really, a range of experience around doom, which is the topic for the night. And you'll be forgiven for thinking this might be about the election tomorrow in the United Kingdom, but we might stray onto that topic a bit, but we'll try to avoid it. But I'm really delighted to have here a wonderful panel. Robbie MacDonald from Exeter University. We have Peter Hudson from Penn State University, Mark Brown from Royal Holloway, and we have Katie Hampson from Glasgow University. And I've asked them all to make an initial kind of statement around the topic for the evening, which is about infectious diseases, their spread, their proliferation. I got up this morning to see Barack Obama on my television telling me about the concerns related to Ebola. And I often think with these sorts of broadcasts, which do go global very quickly. In fact, Obama has this policy of putting everything onto YouTube, it seems, immediately. So you can find that very interview, very broadcast on YouTube already. And I wondered whether the panel thought that we are living in a more complicated or dangerous or risky situation insofar as the spread of infectious disease is concerned. So I've asked them all to make a just opening statement about doom and whether you think it is, as we're told, that it seems worse than it was perhaps before, there's more at stake. So maybe I'll start with you, Robin.
The question of whether we're all doomed is a tricky one. And of course, it appeals to the media, and this sense of impending doom is one that's easy to make a story about. And whether we're all doomed, I think, is probably something we're not well placed to judge at the moment. But that society has changed is very clearly the case, and that modern society with changes in global transportation and in communications and in our occupation of increasingly wild habitats has brought us into contact with a wider range of situations in which diseases can emerge. And that's the sort of pattern that we've seen across the world. And Ebola is a very good example of something that perhaps might not have been predicted decades ago, but now we see that a very high proportion of new and emerging infections of humans are coming from animals and then specifically from wildlife. It's because the way society has changed in those parts of the world that we see those emergencies and then we see them spread. So certainly we are facing much more in the way of hazardous situations as a result of how society has changed. Doom perhaps is playing more to the way that these stories are played out in the media.
Yes. Peter, would you say something similar?
I'm a great optimist. Are we doomed? Yes. No, we are doomed unless we do something about it, unless we change society, unless we change. Everything that Robbie said, I totally endorse. But how could we change? What are we going to change in this world? Well, population growth of humans is certainly one of those. But I also think the key to this is education. I think this is the basis of what we should do, and I think we should be reaching out to educate people about not only the risks and threats, but also about their responsibilities as well. And I think so. Well, I think we are doomed, not necessarily from infectious disease within the short term. I think we can do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mark, over to you.
I think that dichotomies are really appealing to human brains. We like A, B, black, white, yes, no. But I think they're also really dangerous because if you have too many dichotomies and you don't get the result that you're expecting, you start not to treat the next bit of news seriously. So with a lot of the emergent diseases that we see both in human and animal populations upon which we rely, there tends to be the initial, oh goodness, this is awful, and it's all going to fall apart unless we do something. And then quite often something isn't done and it doesn't fall apart. And I think we need to think more carefully about how we talk about problems and recognize that they vary in their impact, and that, as Peter said, we can do something to control that. I think we're going to have a much more realistic ability as a society to deal with these issues if we grow up a little bit about how we discuss them.
Okay, Katie.
I'm definitely a glass half full kind of person, so I don't think we're doomed. I think humans as a global population have got a remarkable capacity to come up with innovative solutions and technological advances. But I think that the Ebola situation at the moment really strikes home the fact that the capacity in the poorest parts of the world, the infrastructure, the resources to cope with diseases which would not cause a problem in rich countries are just really, really lacking. And I think that's where the global community has to actually act to change things, because future generations are going to look back at us and kind of, equate it to the situation in Rwanda or the slave trade or previous generations where we had the chance to act, we could have prevented things, and it's going to have a really long legacy, but we have the ability to change that.
So I'm worried about the complacency in the developed world. What is the likelihood of one of us being exposed? Well, Katie and I go to Africa regularly, so it's much higher for us. But there is this huge complacency in the Northern Hemisphere about this. And yet the likelihood of you dying in West Africa from this disease is huge. And then you say, well, why hasn't the Northern Hemisphere actually helped with this in a much bigger way? And WHO have just been totally dysfunctional on this. The public health system there is just in a terrible mess. There's a whole pile of other things that we need to consider and respond to very, very quickly. And I'm just worried. So while I now live in America, and I'm clearly do not have a central Pennsylvanian accent, I do worry that Obama's response is to send out 3,000 troops. I mean, imagine what that looks like to the people in Sierra Leone and Liberia when they have these troops with guns and uniforms. They've been in civil unrest for many, many years. The first thing they're going to do is run off into the boonies or run off into the forest and hide from it, and that's not what we want to actually happen.
Yeah.
I do have some concerns about that response.
Yes.
But I do think we should be doing something.
Yeah.
At least he's doing something.
Well, Rob, you mentioned a different response. Do you think there is a different response required in this era, or is it more of what we do well, or do you think there are unique characteristics today to the nature of the problem that require a different kind of response?
Well, I think that Peter's right to remark that it's impressive that 3,000 troops are deployed, and I guess they're thinking there towards maintenance of social order as much as maintenance of disease control.
Yeah.
So I can see that as these sort of epidemics expand, taking in wider areas and larger numbers of people, then it's the threat to other elements of society and structure that start to break down and then would accelerate the spread of infection. So I think as a means of maintaining social order, then this is the sort of response that could be helpful. I mean, Pete's also right that our response in the North has not been as good as it could be. And I think probably as scientists, our response is sometimes not as helpful as it could be, in that with the best will in the world, a lot of our intent in doing science in this area is in generating quality science, as opposed to generating solutions for disease control.
Yeah.
And the two are sometimes very closely related, but a lot of the time they're not.
Yes.
So I think there is, a situation in which we should take some responsibility as academic researchers, as scientists, that as a community, not necessarily as individuals, but as a community, our aims are not always put in the right direction.
Yeah.
So I think there are two components to that response. So I hear what you're saying, Robbie, but I think there are two components. There is the ambulance chasing situation or taxi chasing situation that we actually have in West Africa at the moment. Who is infecting whom, how we should be responding to that. as research academics interested in the disease biology, we tend to respond to data. So once this epidemic is over and we have the detailed data, both about the evolution of the virus, about the death rate of people, about the spatial spread of it, then we can start to analyze that and say, we should have been prepared by doing this. But we as a community don't respond unless we actually have data, and the data are being generated at this very moment. Having said that, that former side, the taxi chasing, ambulance chasing group of people, which includes the CDC, and I think they've done an okay job. They're trying their best. But they don't have the people on the ground to work out who had infected whom. They don't have the communications to actually call up different parts. The telephone system isn't working. And the really worrying thing is this whole thing, the whole infrastructure is going to collapse even further. So you don't know where the infection is. You don't know who's dying. You don't know the rate of that sort of mortality. Not because us as scientists might want to address it, but because you could try and solve it now. And we're in this very interesting part of the epidemic curve where it's going exponential. And it's imperative that we put into operation the procedures to turn that over and bring that down now. But it could be huge.
Yeah.
It could be, and if you make any estimates, and people are trying to make estimates about what the death rate is going to be, whatever, we're in September the 17th, and it's over 2,500 now. But it could, and the expectation is 5,000, isn't it? Or is it
20,000 infected, so 10,000 deaths.
But those are, those confidence intervals are monstrous. We have no idea what this is going to do. And I hear Mark's point about we shouldn't be, we shouldn't over-dramatize this, but we have to capture it within that uncertainty, I think.
But I think there's an element of the science that's coming out now. Some of the latest modelling papers that I've seen are all about, okay, what's the risk of it getting to America?
Yes.
What's the risk? And that's kind of missing the point a bit. I mean, we know that it's a very low risk. And if it's a very low risk and we publish it's a very low risk, is that just going to then say, okay, well, it's happening to people far away that we don't really worry about? I mean, when really we should be able to say now, where are the places that are the most underserved and you're going to have the highest risk of dying because of the lack of infrastructure and so on. And really, I mean, we should have seen this coming 10 years ago. I mean, we should have been able to improve the capacity to be able to deal with the situation. So it's kind of a sad reflection on the lack of capacity building and strengthening.
To build on that, I think there's a lack of integration between what we know, perhaps in our area of science, and what we might expect from that, and how development and development aid is actually going forward. We heard, I know the conference we're at today, we heard a really interesting talk about how changes to increase water supply and enable irrigation to enable people to feed themselves have knock-on effects where they end up with a much higher disease prevalence and disease load. And that's not a small-scale thing. Development aid, is going out there to try to make people healthier, and that's through many ways, not just through food, but through infrastructure. But when you build roads, you increase transport, you increase human movement. And it seems that a lot of the way that the world is developing and has developed already in the first world in terms of transport, in terms of movement, that all relates to epidemiology, that all relates to disease ecology. Going into new areas, we know there are lots of examples in the past of as you move into new areas, new diseases emerge. We know this happens. And so perhaps, as scientists, we should be pushing for that kind of information to be included in how development aid works, or at least the advice that we can give to societies who are developing to enable them to do that in a way which will limit the negative impacts of that development, not just in terms of environmental degradation, but also in terms of health degradation through increases in epidemic diseases. But how one goes about doing that, I don't know.
How you go about doing it when the actual emergence of the infection on any one occasion is hugely stochastic. is the problem. Because I mean, you're right, Katie, that 10 years ago we might have predicted that something like this would happen, and it would have been a certainty that at some point, probably in Africa, something like this would happen. But then when it actually happens, and then the scale of how it spreads and where it takes place, it would have been extremely hard to predict. And so putting in place any infrastructure that wasn't oriented towards something that was very responsive, where you could drop infrastructure and means and people into doing something about that problem, is very hard. I mean, continental scale development might well eventually put the continent in a position where they could cope. But meanwhile, it's actually just that responsive mode.
So I think part of the solution to this is that we really need, and it's very important that we do this in the infectious disease world, an interdisciplinary approach that embraces everything from what the immunologists are doing to obviously what the epidemiologists are doing, because we would say that, wouldn't we? But I think there are other areas of the science that we're not integrating enough. So I'm always concerned about the huge gap between the social sciences and between our own sciences, for example. It's the way you change the behavior of the people. How do we change the behavior of the people with burial rituals so that they don't all become infected when you have somebody who's infected with Ebola? How do you actually persuade people not to run away? How do you actually get them to come positively to the local place? I mean, obviously that needs a public health system. So we have to make sure that we have that in operation, but then we incorporate this social science. I think that's a major challenge facing us, because up until now, it's been very difficult to bring those two areas together, to look at things in a properly integrated way.
And I think that demands a different approach to science, because we're very short-term driven and grant cycles and so on, whereas if you really want to make a difference, you've got to establish personal relationships, you've got to invest in things for the long term, because it's not going to be easy, and we're not very well structured or financed to do that at the moment.
Surely it depends on education. We've got to get our education system. It comes back to something Mark was talking about. You know, it's not a dichotomous situation. It's people are being able to understand uncertainty. And you start trying to talk to people about uncertainty, they don't want to know. Am I going to get it or am I not? And it's easy because what everybody says, if you live in America, you're not going to get it. Okay, I don't care. I'm going to go to the pubs. You know, you know, the likelihood of you getting it is this. And the likelihood has increased today. And we need to educate people about understanding likelihood.
But I think, I definitely agree with you. I think social media here has a real role to play. I mean, we're talking about populations that are very distant from us geographically, but there's no reason why we can't hear people's stories. And making those connections is going to be much more persuasive than statistics of the number of people that have died. I mean, you just hear anybody who's worked in a Ebola-affected area, or you talk to some family who's suffered a death in the family. I mean, communicating that to people is going to be more effective than statistics, I think.
You know, actually, I agree totally, because I just read this morning as I woke up, I read the news blog, and they'd opened this new hospital, and they brought a child there, and the child died as he actually arrived at the hospital. It was such a tragic story. And then the next person to enter the hospital was actually his father, and the mother had died, and he then subsequently died. And it just hits your heartstrings, doesn't it?
It's pretty doom and gloom.
Mark, does this resonate with you? Do you think education should focus on perhaps the links between social science and science? What are the key kind of drivers that need to change within education from your perspective on this kind of issue?
I think it depends upon who you're educating. So, and if we're talking about educating the Western developed world in what they should be supporting to enable us to have a global community where issues like emergent diseases can be dealt with properly or prevented, that's a very different question from what education do we need to bring and support in developed countries, not take to them. They don't need us to take things to them. They need us to support them in doing what works in their society.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very different kind of education. Probably there, it is about changing behaviours, as Peter was saying. It's about changing attitudes and towards public health behaviours, towards a lot of things which people don't think about. They just do because they've always done things that way. And also an understanding of what risks are. So if you don't know that doing something causes someone to catch a disease or increases the risk of your family catching a disease, you'll carry on doing it, no matter what anybody tells you. But if you understand, if you really deeply understand, then you will change your behaviour on your own, because you'll understand what the negative impacts of that are.
Yes.
But I think education in the Western world, I think you have to marry that emotional stuff that Katie was talking about with actually the likelihood, because I think that's really important too, because if people don't understand risk and they don't understand hazard, that's when you get this detachment, because, you know, bird flu, oh, we were all going to die, it was going to go everywhere. Oh, it didn't. Oh, that's all right then. A lot of people don't then remember a year later that we didn't, because a lot of actions took place to stop it from happening. And then we see the next bout of bird flu appearing somewhere, and people go, oh, but it was all right last time. So humans are not very good at likelihood, and they're not very good at small numbers. And I don't know how to make them better at that, but I think it's something we need to figure out, because it really matters when you're dealing not with societies of a village of 100 people, but when you're dealing with a global community where people move around all the time.
I think that's a particularly interesting point now, in the sense that we have communities here now which we have huge vaccine refusal problems, because people think they're no longer at risk, and they no longer have the memory of how dangerous some of these diseases can be, and it's kind of a bit scary when you see an outbreak of measles in Swansea or something.
But I think that's a good example, because it captures how important our understanding of how different social phenomena emerge and how they then perpetuate. And Pete's view that we need to treat social science more seriously as natural science is absolutely right. And in my own work, I've come increasingly to believe that actually ecology, biology is only contributing a really minor component to any eventual successful. I think that it's probably much more to do with people than in my case animals or wildlife. But I think we're also guilty as natural scientists of having a pretty primitive understanding of the social sciences. Yes. So it isn't just about better working out a way of someone getting what it is that we're talking about, or getting them to change their mind so that they agree with us. Because and I think that has characterised our approach to science, social sciences, as just a way of improving our communication of the wisdom that we have to impart. And I think the challenge for us as disease biologists is to work with solutions that actually fit in the social context in which they have to operate, and not try and change the society to fit our way, our modus operandi. And I think that's as true of Western and developed societies as it is in the developing world. And in my own area, I work primarily in the UK about controlling bovine TB in badgers and cattle. And there is deep-seated social conflict there that we understand really very poorly. Yes. And as a group of natural scientists, we certainly haven't provided solutions. We've got lots of information and lots of understanding, but not much in the way of solutions. And that's because we haven't grasped the nettle of understanding the depth of how society operates with these complex problems.
I agree. But I do think Katie brings up a really important point about this apathy of vaccines or even drug development, because we believe that if you have, and this goes back exactly to the first thing Mark said, if you have this thing, then it's going to solve everything, so why worry about it? But we actually know, particularly with antibiotic resistance and in response to some vaccines, that of course the bug evolves around it. Now, sitting in America, I have to say I am shocked by how the American public and even some of my fellow academics do not understand the simple processes of evolution, which I think we teach very well in this country. But the whole point about antibiotic resistance, or resistance against using drugs against malaria, or even against mosquitoes or something, is there is rapid evolution by those pests to get around that problem. And we have to find evolutionary proof mechanisms to try and understand that and solve those issues. So we need to develop drugs that are smarter than the evolution process. We have to find ways to actually stop it. We should also be thinking, so another issue that I want to throw out there is that we continually talk about single diseases. And quite understandably, we've been talking about Ebola. It's there on the front page all the time. It's things that all four of us really concerned about. But every individual is an aggregation of current infections and an integral of all previous infections. And we've all probably had different infections. I mean, I can list out I've had measles. I'm old enough to have been exposed to measles, but I've also had tuberculosis. I've had a whole series of diseases. So my immunological response is different from the next person. And we have to think about this community of disease and stop just thinking about one disease at a time. So for example, we see in some infections very different characteristics. I'll take Lyme disease as an example. People show very different responses to that. Is that because of who the host is, or is it because it's actually a multi-pathogenic infection taking place? And we have to start thinking about the community of diseases and not just single infection.
Yes. And is that part of your education idea, that this needs to be a fundamental way of teaching people, way of educating, way of communicating infection? Is it?
So
where is the lack, if that's an appropriate term?
So I think it is beholden upon us in the northern universities to provide the opportunities and to provide opportunities for people in the developing world, their educational needs. So I believe in MOOCs, I believe in reaching out, I believe in developing programs. And Glasgow University, where Katie comes from, have been exemplary in what they've actually done in the infectious disease side, particularly in East Africa. But there's a whole string of other things that we could also be doing. So MOOCs are mass open online courses where you run a course online and people can get it on their telephones.
I think in line of education as well, it's also worth thinking about education in our field more broadly. For example, medics don't necessarily get training in evolution.
Totally.
And how that affects drug administration and so on is really important. And maybe how the general public even responds to whether they want to be vaccinated in the first place. So I think our whole science education can probably do with a bit of upheaval and enlightenment in the fact that evolution is literally a part of our everyday lives, and it's not something that happened 1,000 years ago and we only see it in the fossils. So
probability and uncertainty would be the other big one. That clinicians, whether they're medics or vets, are not. That isn't really part of the thinking. I mean, obviously, there are specialist disciplines within those that would get to that very quickly. But for the most part, understanding, for example, when we heard a talk today about a probabilistic approach to diagnostics, so understanding that genuine status of the animal is not a question of black or white, it has the infection or not, but one of probability. And I think that as a concept is really useful one once you start thinking about epidemiological processes and outbreaks and spread of infection, as opposed to the condition of the individual that you're seeing in front of you, which is how most clinicians are trained to consider the position of that individual.
So just to add to that, Robbie, infection does not necessarily cause disease. So there are individuals that we know that are infected but not actually showing disease symptoms, and that is at the moment a sort of major issue. So there's a lot of asymptomatic individuals, and we know this can be immensely important in some infections. So there's a huge amount of stuff to actually be done, and it's really exciting, both intellectually and at the global scale.
Yeah. I mean, it seems clear that there's a massive shift in how people are thinking about education. Mark, do you see in your university that things like MOOCs, are there additional spaces where education can take place? Is there space within course programs to bring in some of these aspects? Or where should that kind of education take place ultimately, I think?
Well, I think the wonderful thing about MOOCs is they're not trapped within a university. So I have little experience of how the undergraduate system works in the States, but I have a lot of experience of how the undergraduate system works in the UK and Ireland, and it's slow, and you're constrained. And it's hard to change anything within a course, let alone change the way courses link together. Or, the concept, as Katie was talking about, non-organismal biologists being taught about evolution, getting that across to colleagues within a school of biological sciences who also haven't been trained about evolution and therefore don't understand why their students should need it because they didn't need it, is, I think, a general problem across universities. And it's not because these people are stupid. They're not. They're very, very smart. But it's because humans don't like change that they don't see the need for. And also, academics, I think, are hard-pressed. We always say this, but it is true. And change takes time. So I think it's actually much easier to do the change outside through things like MOOCs. And also actually going out of your university and going and talking to people. So I think outreach is hugely important. And I think everybody I know does a huge amount of outreach. You go to schools to talk to children, you go to people's societies for the interest that they have. So I talk to a lot of honeybee societies, but I also talk to other local groups as well. And that's how you get education out there into the community. I don't think you do it by changing university programs per se. It's a small market, and it's a very specialist market. It needs to be much broader than that.
Yeah. So we should be moving towards lifelong education.
Yeah, it's about democratizing education, not leaving it in a silo.
I also feel as though I'm not sure where the technology in the media is going to go. So I find it astonishing when I look at the phone I had 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And since I moved to the US 10 years ago, I'm actually carrying my daughter's phone from 10 years ago, which is a pink little Nokia. And it's totally different from everybody else's phone. But the whole point is that everybody now has phones. And what is that phone technology going to do over the next 5, 10 years? And what are the educational opportunities that could arise from that? How can we use MOOCs to educate people in Africa so that even a little girl in West Africa that has to still carry water can actually get education straight online on her phone? And those sort of opportunities, I think, are monstrous. We really need to think outside the box about how we're going to embrace the technology. And it doesn't scare me, but it's amazing where those technology.
What was the opportunity that Penn State saw in creating a course like that, Peter? I mean, did they see it the same way that you're seeing it, as a means of extension and assisting development, or was it seen as a commercial opportunity?
It certainly wasn't seen as a commercial opportunity. It cost us $60,000 to do that MOOC, which is actually called Epidemics. But I'm trying to change the mind of our university and say, this isn't about Pennsylvania. This isn't even about America, but it's about the world. And so they decided to put out a call for a series of MOOCs, and we did 3, and this was one of the ones that won. And the feedback has been phenomenal, and so everybody's excited about doing more, but making sure we do them in the right way. So that's interesting in itself.
I mean, one of the things that University of Salford's investing into is Manchester Science Festival, and it seems to me that there's not a city in the United Kingdom that doesn't have its own science festival these days. But I wonder whether those are, now with 20 years of hindsight of having these festivals, are, from your perspective, useful ways of bringing science to communities, of engaging people. Do they do the work they ought to?
I was at the Cheltenham Science Festival this year as a speaker on a panel rather similar to this, actually. Although we faced the audience there. And I really went down just to do that. So I drove down from home and got there a little bit before. But I did have a chance to wander around, and what I saw was amazing. And I also saw a lot of school kids who were there going around enjoying themselves. And I think science festivals are fantastic at enabling people to enjoy science, which is quite hard. Because science is often viewed as difficult, I think, and it's often viewed as you've got a lot of dry stuff to learn. And so if you can excite people, and I think you have to do that in a hands-on way, and that hands-on way could be via an electronic medium, or it could be actually getting people into a space where they see something that energizes them. And that's what I was seeing there. It was brilliant. When I did the discussion, there were no children there at all. The average age, I would say, was probably around 60, 65. And it was fantastic because it was a whole different array of people who were engaging in a different way. And I think what the science festivals do is they create a variety of different ways people can engage. And they're there. They're physically there in your space. They're there for a week. There are posters everywhere. You drop in for 5 minutes. I think they do a fantastic job. I don't know they're the only way to go, but I think they're a fantastic thing, and I think it would be very sad if they died because we all decided that everything had to be online.
Yeah.
I don't think online replicates human experience.
Yes, yes.
Although I may be in an increasing minority.
I am seriously worried about our science education. This is picking up on Mark's point at the moment. And I'm seriously worried that our teachers, I'm talking about primary school and secondary school, are just grossly underpaid. It is imperative, I feel, that the Western world, since most of the consumables have gone over to production, has gone over to the Far East, but I think it's essential that if we're going to sustain our society, that we become an intellectual society, developing technology and things. And that requires deep education. And at the moment, it's second rate to become a school teacher at times. I mean, I know there are some dedicated people, but my whole point is that we must be paying them to do this really, really important job. In all honesty, in America, when we take in our undergraduates, we basically tell them, forget what you did at school, because what you've been taught isn't good enough, because this is what we're going to teach you now. And that's wrong. We should be teaching the kids, particularly from 5 years old onwards. We need to be teaching them really, really well about science, technology, and mathematics. They should be proud to be part of it. We've got to invest in that level of education if we're going to sustain the Western world.
But what they lack is resources very often in areas in which they don't personally have strengths. And one way that I think scientists can engage is actually through perhaps their outreach officers at universities, all of which I believe have science outreach officers now, because it's part of what the university is doing, is to engage actually with the curriculum and go, okay, well, over a 2 or 3 year period of time, I and my graduate students could actually develop a pack which will be online, which teachers can use, which will be sitting happily within the curriculum, so it's something that they want to use, that will actually bring science more alive to the students and help them do their job. But I think also we can help in other ways.
I don't disagree. That was all part of what my emphasis was. But I do feel that your outreach office should be getting the funds to be able to do that. We should be actually having grants given to get those partnerships developed. And those should be coming from government. They should be coming at a high level.
Well, asking government to do more and paying people more money seems like a good place to end any debate. We are out of time, unfortunately, and we have a bit more to see and do tonight. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.